Okay, so this is theme 2, and it is towards a left party in South Africa. We have an apology from Natalia. She is unable to join us, but I'm sure we can send her paper if she sends one. So yeah, we are running a bit over time, so I'm going to start. So if Tshiamo can, so the panelists for this session are Tshiamo, Janet, and then Stephen. So Tshiamo, you can go ahead. And you have 15 minutes.
Okay.
You have 20 minutes, sorry.
Yeah, let me just open up my presentation quickly, share my screen. So I'm going to be presenting a bit on middle-class nationalism, like I spoke a little bit about during the previous discussion. And it's a singular point I'm going to be making, a little bit about why we should avoid that in any kind of organizing we're doing, but including any form of organizing of a political party. Okay, so does everyone see my screen?
Yeah, we see it now.
Okay, great. So I just start with this quote by Thomas Sankara, which simply says, well, revolutionaries as individuals can be murdered. You cannot kill ideas. You know, it's a really powerful idea that we are kind of leading on in terms of eco-socialism, the climate justice charter, and I don't think that that's something that can be killed. Okay, but let's start with the actual presentation here. So my paper is about the second liberation, the essay that I wrote, just speaking a little bit about needing a new kind of liberatory movement and rethinking what liberation looks like right now. The first liberation, of course, and not that we aren't still fighting colonialism. The first discussion was speaking about how neoliberal capitalism is still an existent force. So there is, of course, still a need to liberate ourselves from the wider superstructures of oppression. It's not to say that the second liberation means the first one has been achieved. But in terms of what we think was a liberatory movement was the 20th century African liberation movements. And this mostly took the form of African nationalism, which was used as a tool to oppose colonialism. But it resulted in multiple different forms of failures, which we can analyze. You can look at top-down nationalism and Pan-Africanism, which created large organizations, bureaucracies, and governments, which were meant to, mostly on their own, institute some form of economic project within African countries. Sometimes those economic projects never intended to move away from extractivist forms of economy, so it still relied heavily on mining and wage labor. You saw the formation of a large African bureaucracy, Organization of African Unity, which became the African Union, large sorts of intercontinental African agreements that there would be some top-down nationalistic approach to liberation. You had an alignment of African development to foreign aid in the international financial system. In 1978, Thomas Sankara actually gave a really powerful speech to the Organization of African Unity, just berating it for creating systems of debt within the African continent. You had strong centralized governments. I mean, even the more progressive African leaders like Julius Nyerere were really strong on their oppositions, really cracked down a lot on opposition politics. And then, of course, that was followed with low civic education or capacities. So it was almost like we had to give off all of our power to a centralized state bureaucracy or petty bourgeois who would be responsible for implementing economic liberatory projects. At the same time, these bureaucracies were very vulnerable and very corrupt. We've already seen, of course, the downfall of many African states to single-party dictatorships or single-person dictatorships as well, where single leaders ruled for 30 years plus, changed constitutions so they could lead for longer. We can expand a lot on post-colonial corruption in African states because the nationalist parties that were formed were also very weak nationalist parties. There was a centralization of sources of wealth. You can speak about centralizing oil wealth in Nigeria down to centralizing mineral wealth in South Africa. Various African states centralized the beneficiaries of mineral resources. And there was also lots of extreme militarization and political instabilities, multiple coups. I mean, Gutierrez Gandhi in massacres in Zimbabwe post 1980s, multiple coups within Nigeria throughout the 20th century. Various African states had extreme militarization. You can speak about different political leaders like Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, who were assassinated through a collaboration of internal resistances and, of course, neoliberal Western forces that cooperated to remove such leaders, Eduardo Mondlane. As you can continue in terms of the political stability of the 20th century. So this period of the first liberation wasn't a liberation at all. And so we're left with what was described in the previous session, that belly of that beast of an African state that is still extractivist, still exploiting most of its labor class, widespread hunger and poverty and suffering. So we need to prevent this from happening again. And we're seeing, again, this reemergence of nationalist party politics, where a lot of us give off all of our authority to a political party under the presumption that that party will form some form of bureaucracy or state government that will liberate us. And this just isn't true. And I mean, we aren't the first ones to observe this. So I'm going to quote a bit from Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. And he's got in the third chapter, which is called The Pitfalls of National Consciousness, he really describes the nationalist political party. A good description of the African National Congress in South Africa, ZANU-PF, SWAPO, and Namibia, etc. They mobilize the people with slogans of independence, and for the rest, leave it to future events. When such parties are questioned on the economic program of the state that they're clamoring for, or on the nature of the regime which they propose to install, they are incapable of replying because precisely they are completely ignorant of the economy of their own country. And Fanon is actually going to make lots of different observations about nationalist movements, middle-class nationalist movements in particular within this chapter. The second thing I just want to highlight, he says, is this national bourgeoisie steps into the shoes of the former European settlement. Doctors, baristas, traders, commercial travelers, general agents, and transport agents. It considers that the dignity of the country and its own welfare require that it should occupy all these posts. The national middle class discovers its historic mission, that of intermediary. And this is a really good description, not just of nationalist movements in the 1960s that Fanon was writing to, but also nationalist movements right now. A very good description of the ANC. But it speaks to how nothing has really changed from this original description of the liberatory movement of the 20th century and how it's kind of maintained right now. So just to summarize what Fanon is trying to say, he argues that the state becomes controlled by a petty bourgeoisie. Marx, of course, already analyzed how the petty bourgeoisie, which is incorporated in the state, organizes the means of production for a larger bourgeois class. So Fanon says the national middle class, which takes over power at the end of the colonial regime, is also an underdeveloped middle class. And he then uses that to explain why there's so much ignorance, corruption, and incompetence within nationalist movements. You've seen a lot of that within the African National Congress, immense ignorance of people who are in government, lots of cronyism and nepotism and corruption, and sometimes just downright incompetence and incapacity to achieve liberatory goals. He concludes then that existent oppressions are going to be maintained, that the national bourgeoisie, since it is strung up to defend its immediate interests, sees no farther than the end of its nose. And ultimately any nationalist political party, even if it's supposedly left-leaning, is going to be prone to this exact same assessment that Fanon realized in Algeria and other African nations. It's interesting to also read Fanon from an eco-socialist perspective. I don't think many people do that. Fanon also writes that the national economy during this period of independence is not set on a new footing. It is still concerned with the ground nut harvest, with the cocoa crop and the olive yield. In the same way, there is no change in the marketing of basic products and not a single industry set up in the country. We go on sending out raw materials. We go on being Europe's small farmers who specialize in unfinished products. So, Fanon is really writing to how nationalist economic policies tend to rely on extractivism and mineral resources, and therefore don't really change much of how the economy was organized during the colonial periods. And in many ways, he's writing against this form of extractive economy. So you can really interpret Frantz Fanon as pushing this agenda of eco-socialism, even if very often we don't see it in that way. This is the same in South Africa. When the South African Native National Convention, which became the African National Congress, was formed, it was always a petty bourgeois movement, comprised of an educated elite. Their first major strategy was to appeal to imperial powers in London, just as further proof. Over time, as Fanon says, they're going to adopt slogans of independence, which developed into the 1955 Freedom Charter, which many people would analyze as this message and this really powerful message of liberation that was sent to people in order to gain support for the nationalist movement. But at the same time, I think there was an understanding around that time in the 1950s when it came to actual organizing that the African National Congress might be giving out these slogans of independence and liberation, but wasn't necessarily up to the task of creating strong anarchist ground movements that would, liberate and achieve what the Freedom Charter was speaking about. And so in 1959, you had the formation of the Pan-Africanist Congress. You already had a first awakening and a slow splintering away from what was already seen as a nationalist movement that wouldn't achieve the objectives that we wanted them to. A growing resistance to apartheid spread, and at the moment that liberation was inevitable, I think there was this immense project to ensure that the ANC would emerge victorious. And Fanon writes a lot about how the middle class centralizes itself as the only people that can provide liberation, to make sure that there is a narrative that is spread throughout the entire community, that it is in us, that you must trust. And of course, we've seen that the ultimate conclusion is the emergence of neoliberalism in South Africa. So where are we right now and what do we need? And this is what Fanon calls an awakening. He says that the people stagnate deplorably in unbearable poverty, but slowly they awaken on the unutterable treason of their leaders. South Africa, of course, has had many ripples of awakenings. You can look at service delivery process as some form of awakening that there is something wrong, but there's still this major appeal to improving the nationalist movement, maybe correcting the government, maybe replacing this nationalist party with a different party that's also going to implement some form of state bureaucracy to liberate us and to solve our problems. Some of this also finding expression in Marxist-Leninism, this idea of creating a really strong state that will plan, centralize the economy, and find ways to liberate people. But as I write in my submission, the mission of our time is to be liberated again, first from our oppressors and then from our liberators. We need to move away from thinking of a nationalist party that from the top down ensures some form of liberation, because the assessment from Fanon is clear. The assessment from just looking at past African nationalist parties, even if they intended to be left-leaning, you're just going to give a lot of power to some petty bourgeoisie, and you're going to maintain your extractivist economy. So, the solutions abound: production cooperatives, food sovereignty, traditional building, water commons, multiple forms of anarchist visions of the future, things that have been presented before and also will be presented on tomorrow in some of the other papers that I've seen here. So these are the various practical solutions to building ground up ideas that don't rely on a nationalist party to implement it. They don't rely on a nationalist party for it to exist. If your liberation relies on the creation of and forming of a nationalist party, I think the same prediction that was made by Fanon, the same prediction that multiple African intellectuals have made over time, will just find expression again. So what would the role of a left party then be? I think the first thing is we need to deconstruct an existent middle-class nationalism. We need to deconstruct the idea that is going to be some technical or academic elite of people who will form bureaucracies to liberate people. It needs to create the means for ground level visions. If a left party is going to exist, it should exist not for its own sake, but for the sake of empowering a lot of these anarchist visions we have. And then finally, I think it needs to popularize a new consciousness. We need to have a new consciousness within people that we are our own liberators, because the kind of consciousness that we have right now, which Fanon calls a national consciousness, is that we should go to the polls, elect a government, and then allow that government to, through its own means, enact our liberation. And time again, we've seen that is a pitfall, So at the same time, I think electoral politics, parliamentary participation, and other contexts of power, they cannot be for power itself. The goal shouldn't be to have a left party, so the left party gains power. That's always going to result in the same problem. It also cannot be for the sake of creating any new nationalist idea. It needs to be for the destruction of nationalism altogether if we're going to achieve any form of liberation. So a left party needs to be using popular politics as a means to destroy popular politics. So if you're going to run a left party, that party effectively needs to exist such that it will no longer one day exist. It needs to be a party that's really clear in its attempt to not seize power, but to distribute power. There should never be, in the construction of this party, this idea that there's one leader and that person should attain lots of power, build up lots of support for this one charismatic leader, and then hope to get them elected and then rely on that person to implement any form of nationalist idea. So yeah, this is the end of my presentation. I just wanted to also go back to Thomas Sankara, who says, you cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness. In this case, it comes from nonconformity, the courage to turn your back on the old formulas, the courage to invent the future. It took the madmen of yesterday for us to be able to act with extreme clarity today. I want to be one of those madmen. We must dare to invent the future. So with that, I say, if we're going to create a left party, it should be a ground-based party that doesn't seek power, but seeks the redistribution of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tshiamo. Janet, I'm just going to hand over straight to you, if you're ready.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so let me just reflect quickly on some of the other presentations. Firstly, Tshiamo, thank you. I think that's a really valid input and a good starting point for this issue of what kind of response or left movement or party we need. And I quite agree with you. I mean, the age of the national liberation movement and the idea that this is a revolutionary movement or a national democratic movement, that time has passed. And I also agree with the other speakers who emphasized the urgency of the response to the situation. And I also agree with Michelle about the importance of democracy. And my argument is really premised on that we haven't used the democratic space that is available to us in South Africa to pursue this left project. I don't agree with Michelle entirely about the technology issue and some of the other speakers. In fact, I think the technology provides space as well for certain left or eco-socialist responses. And I also don't agree with Gunnett about reform and the state, whether the state can be a platform for reform. And for, let's say, systemic change of the system, I also agree with Mazibuko about the importance of the left having a real mass base, and that these little projects of vegetable gardens and so on dispersed throughout the country, they really don't constitute a movement which is capable of bringing about the systemic change we need. So I think that we have to find some way of translating that into mobilization sort of within the space that the state provides and influencing the state to allow a greater space. So let me just reflect. The last thing, one of the last point that Vishwas made was that elections in the future are going to run around the issue of climate change. And are we going to play any role in that? I mean, do we see our movement responding at that level? Okay, so just, I don't know if you can see my t-shirt. Guys, do you remember this t-shirt? Cool it with people's power. Dominic will definitely remember it.
Yeah,
so I think it was 9 years ago now at the COP17, I actually met up with Vishwas, and we had the sort of initial discussions about the idea of an eco-socialist international. And this was when the Million Climate Jobs campaign was launched with the labor movement, with Kasatu at that time. Now, we've actually gone backwards since then in terms of a movement around in response to climate change. And I think it's really serious that, I mean, we do have to reflect on that. Like, why have we gone backwards? And why have we not been able to use the space that is available for this? So the argument that I'm going to make, and let me go to the paper that I circulated. So I was trying to look in a sort of strategic way at the questions that Vishwas was posing for this forum. And the question was, firstly, have the conditions changed for such a left project to emerge? And I'm absolutely answering in the affirmative that yes, the conditions have changed. And I think the first panel really outlined many aspects of that the current conjuncture, if you like, and what has changed and what are the conditions which we need to respond to. So despite the fact that in the last 10 years we've gone backwards, in fact, I think that there is a lot more positive space to respond than we are maybe giving credit for. And I think the last panel was a little bit, can I say, pessimistic in its overall outlook. So then the questions following this, if we answer yes, the conditions do exist for this left project to emerge. How does the left party fit in? What strategy, what form, what sort of program should it have? And I'm really focusing on this issue of the strategy, form, and program. So if we can take as the first assumption that there is a left project, the left project in our minds at least is clear, and it's an eco-socialist project. It's a response both to the climate emergency and to the social and economic crisis which faces us. It's the argument for a just transition, for energy democracy, and so on. Let's assume, for the sake of this argument, that we have an agreement on the project. What is the best vehicle for achieving that goal, for working towards that? And I don't think a party is necessarily the best vehicle or form for pursuing that project. Okay, so I started off, I called this paper initially rethinking movement and party without capitalization, i.e., in South Africa, we talk about the movement, which was the liberation movement. It was the ANC, okay? Forget about it. Forget about it. We talk about the party, and in South Africa, the party, historically referred to the Communist Party, with a capital P. Forget about it. Think about the defense of representative liberal democracy and what that means in terms of how it was defined in the previous session, and what space that allows us. Okay, and what role political parties play in that framework. And then think about movements as social movements as we understand them. But more than that, think about them and think about economic movements. So one of my comrades, Patrick Brennan, I think some of you have met, he said to me this morning, no, actually what we're talking about here is an economic UDF. So it's a broad, inclusive, decentralized movement which can take up, I think, similar to what Mazibuko was talking about in terms of sort of network or interconnected struggles. But it has slightly more coherence than that, in that I see it as trying to build hegemony. Okay, and I'll come back to this concept of hegemony, but working through and across and within political parties and the state to do so. So to contest power through a political party in the representative democracy is not the objective. The objective is to gain hegemony in the whole society. And I would argue, and I'm playing with this argument, so you have to sort of bear with me and engage me on this, because I really have no idea whether it will cohere. But the idea is to form an economic movement which uses the space that we have, assuming that the state is a contested space and is not an instrument of the bourgeoisie or whatever. So let's assume that the state can regulate in such a way that it allows for example, decentralized community-owned renewable energy, which is what Sonny Morgan argues in his paper, as he's been arguing for the last few years. So let's say the state allows that. It seems that it is allowing that. can we not use that space to set up energy democracy movement, which is whatever. It's not centralized, decentralized, locally owned, but it actually is producing value. It's producing income, financial income, money to working class people, to ordinary people. So the important point about the idea of an economic movement as opposed to a political movement or a protest movement or a social movement is that it's not just making demands, although it may make certain demands. It's actually taking economic power and redistributing economic power through this network of movements. So it's, in a way, it's the idea is a sort of movement of movements. So you can see it would include, obviously, food sovereignty movement, the water campaigns that have been going on, the campaigns around renewable energy, cooperative movements, etc. But I think the important thing is that it's neither a political party nor is it a social movement or a protest movement in the way in which we've seen them up till now. So, yeah, I think it's an important challenge, because the movement will gain hegemony if it can provide real benefits to its members. I mean, to its supporters or to the residents, not even members. I don't even imagine it having a membership in that sense. So your local energy cooperative would have a membership, but the model we're looking at is a neighborhood cooperative where all households in that neighborhood are part of it. And they benefit through getting revenue. They get money from that cooperative, from selling energy. So there's a real distribution of assets, of resources, or whatever you want to call them. I don't call them capital. But anyway, so you see the argument there. So let's say we go with the argument that the strategy requires a movement, and we can look at other examples of movements. I mean, I look in the paper a little bit at the examples around the MST and around Kerala province and so on, which I know, I mean, Michelle has looked at in some depth, and we're going to look at tomorrow in terms of international examples. But what I'm arguing coming out of that is we're not here looking at an autonomous movement, which is trying to set up completely self-sufficient communities or sub-territories or something, you know. So it's not really comparable to Rojava or Chiapas and so on in that respect. So we would be looking really at how do we relate to the state in South Africa, our current South African state. And I don't know if you're all familiar with the Lucien van der Walt's papers about modes of politics at a distance from the state. But in a way, I'm taking one of the typologies, which is mobilization with the state, and arguing strongly that this is how we should imagine this movement. And then the question is, well, what's the role of parties, political parties? So I don't see, okay, so I see political parties as important in the sense that you know, this is a democracy, and we are committed to defending the democracy to be able to use that space. And what that means is that we actually have to, as the movement, have to work to gain hegemony within all parties, well, as many parties as we can, including the governing party, which at the moment is the ANC, but it doesn't require it to be the ANC. And it requires whatever parties we can influence through the fact that ordinary people are benefiting from this movement. And the fact that ordinary people are benefiting from this movement means that it will have influence. It will have influence on the political system. So, yeah, that's my sort of very tentative conclusion. But I want to just share with you two additional little things. The one is I've just been examining a thesis from a student who's been looking at the REAP program, the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program in the Northern Cape. And I just want to read what she says about one of the lessons from this. And this is in terms of decentralization and the technology. Okay, so she says, this is in Germany. The strong place of local utilities in Germany meant that following privatization, the notion of a Stadtwerk, it's a local government utility, remained important as a political option. The new generation of local collectively owned energy companies ranged from new local state-run entities to smaller rural cooperatives. They demonstrate that grassroots mobilization and state-led action need not be in opposition. At the same time, energy cooperatives were supported by the state, which purchased the electricity generated by their infrastructure. Seen together, these arrangements cultivated a rich environment for innovation and learning that protected against the commodification of technological development and invited households and community structures to become invested in the configuration of transformative socio-technical systems. And she terms this the social logic of renewable energy. And then she says the key insight from this is that the materiality of dispersed and decentralized renewable energy technology is what made the predominance of collective and public ownership possible. In other words, the social logic of renewable energy development is possible largely by a dispersed and decentralized nature of renewable energy technology. Okay, so that's the one argument about technology. The second argument is from Petras, who I think some of you are familiar with, who wrote a lot about social movements and the state in Latin America. And in this, this is one of my students' papers actually, which I thought was quite useful. This is about water provision. And the argument is left governments and other states should find alternative ways to provide water services and use state power in enhancing participation of water social movements in delivering basic services like water, okay? Veltmeier and Petras insist that social movements should not rely on the electoral party power to be revolutionary. They should develop their revolutionary programs, this is the movement, to engage with the state to bring about social change. Social movements should form active revolutionary alliances with the state and other active partners and have programmatic alliances that enhance the provision of basic services like water provision. Okay, so those were just two observations from other sources, which I thought contribute to the argument. I think I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you, Janet. And then we're just going to hand over to our last presentation, Stephen.
Yeah, okay. I'm not a politician, I'm not a priest, and I'm also not an academic. So I'm not used to standing up and speaking in front of groups of people. And also my think piece is really just something very subjective. It's what I feel. It isn't based on any extensive research or anything. So basically what I just did was I listed why, in my own way, I've been trying to mobilize support for the idea of a new political party under the banner of eco-socialism. And it was really brought home to me in the 2019 elections because none of the existing parties were speaking to the problems of climate change or really addressing the fundamental problems in our country. And also acknowledging that we are a constitutional democracy and that political power does reside with the elected representatives in parliament. And the fact that the Climate Justice Charter movement took the charter to parliament is a testament to that. And I also think it's totally unacceptable that the ANC's got the kind of powers that it has based on the will of 27% of the total voting age population in the country. And that's not even mentioning the DA, the EFF or the IFP. And that basically, except for the ANC and the DA, it seems like the other parties and even the EFF are more parties of personalities. Like, for instance, if Julius Malema, something suddenly happened to him or he went back to the ANC or something, I can't see the EFF carrying on for very long as a single entity. Yeah, and I also think it's pathetic that the Freedom Front Plus is the 5th largest party in Parliament. And they got there on the slogan Slanterig, which is basically Moerhulle, and we know who Hulle is. And yeah, and I also think it is irresponsible and cowardly not to become involved in politics and to contest the elections. Maybe if I say we're not living in the 80s anymore, it might get people, get some people up a bit. So you're saying?
And the 90s.
That's fine. It's really since about 2016, the local government elections, when I started speaking to people and saying, fuck, surely there's something else we can do. Can't there be a new party we can actually vote for, you know? And since then, speaking to people, and in the last 2 years, or since before the 2019 elections, putting it out there on Facebook, the idea of an alternative, I do get a sense that people are eager to volunteer and to become involved. People want to feel that they can actually make a difference, you know, and fight the apathy. And I also do feel that coalition politics is the future and that smaller parties can play a very vital role. Excuse me. And let me see, I don't want to get bogged down too much by this. And then why not? It is a hell of a daunting task, but I can't see why that should not be pursued as one avenue for the broad left in the country. And I suppose in some ways I'm hoping people here will persuade me that it's a cack idea and I should rather go back to growing veggies, which is what I'm good at doing.
The two can coexist.
They can coexist, thank you. Yeah, no, I liked what Janos Varoufakis has to say, that we should dare to dream and then work damn hard towards realizing that dream. And then no party to vote for, you're not alone. In 94, 86% of the voting age population participated in elections. In 2019, it was 46%. So over 11 million registered voters didn't even bother to register. Over 9 million registered voters didn't even bother to vote. And the trend is increasingly for young people that they're just really not interested in voters. Less than 1 in 5 18, 19-year-olds even registered. And less than half of 19 to 34-year-olds registered. And there again, most of them didn't even bother to go and vote in 2019. Okay, that's the 2019 general elections. Total voting age population of about 37.8 million. It's rounded off, but it gives you an idea, you know, not registered. I can't quite see there now. 29% people registered and not voted. 25%, I think. So 54% of South Africans who could vote didn't even bother to take part in the elections. And which means the ANC has actually got this power based on 27% of the total voting age population. That was 2014, had a slightly bigger slice there. If you look at it in this way, the DA and the EFF have actually, in a sense, shrunk since the previous election, since the 2014 election. If you look at it in this total pie chart way. Okay, we've already said that the ANC's got these dictatorial powers based on its 27% of the voting age population. I don't have to go through that again. Yeah, highly responsible in a case of gross negligence and squandered opportunities. And the system may be flawed and is less than perfect, but we have the power to make a difference through the ballot. And then in terms of strategy, these are just really some loose ideas. It's not actually basically strategy, but some ideas that could help mobilize popular support for the idea of a party. And that if one started mobilizing now, one can fairly certainly say that come 2024, one could get 34,000 votes, 35,000 votes and get at least one seat in parliament. You know, many people argue, what's the point of having one lone voice in parliament? I think that's a debate to be had. I think that one voice can make a hell of a difference. If we'd had one eco-socialist party in parliament a month or two ago, they would have accepted our climate justice charter process and been able to take it there into parliament, you know, and get people to listen to the facts. I also think that if one could try and, if the idea takes off that yes, we should have a new left party, to really base it on membership contributions, membership fees. Okay, most working class people wouldn't be able to afford much, but there are many middle class people who would be able to set aside 100, 200 rand a month or whatever towards something like that. So one could build up a war chest and then have money to pay that very big IEC deposit to be able to participate in the elections. But if you get one seat, you get the deposits back. So, and I also think that the provincial elections, one should rather try and focus on the national elections. The provinces really should just be administrative centers. I don't see why each province should have its own legislature, all that expense. What makes Gauteng different from KZN or Western Cape that we must make our own legislation in Gauteng that's going to be different from national legislation? It's just such a waste. So I think that could be one ticket. Am I going here? Am I not pressing it right? Next. Jay? Stuck. Oh. Okay, yeah. And I also think if one did some quite innovative things, like said that the representatives that we're going to send to parliament undertake not to take home more than 10 times the minimum wage. I think parliamentarians now are earning what, 96,000, 100,000 rand a month. So that could also be a way of people saying, okay, we're not in it there just to cream it, to go and make nice money out of becoming a parliamentarian, that we're there to deliver a message, and that the people we send there as messengers to parliament would make that undertaking. And, you know, if one had one representative in parliament, that will be what, 40 grand a month that could go towards communal vegetable gardening. If we've got 10 representatives there, that's almost 500,000 rand a month. So imagine what that could do over a period between one election and the next election. It could really demonstrate that we are there to take a message and to try and make a difference, not just to try and earn a living. And when I was thinking about this and talking to people about it in the last couple of years, it was really around very basic things. Like, firstly, the fact is that we need to be able to breathe, all of us. If we can't breathe, we're all dead within 2 or 3 minutes. Likewise with water. If we don't have water to drink, we're all going to be dead within a couple of days. And if we can't eat, within a couple of weeks, we're virtually dead. And within a month or two, we'll all be dead. So that's what I also really like about the climate justice charter movement, is focusing on those things, you know, bring an end to water problem, hunger and pollution. And that building a party doesn't mean giving up on community mobilization or trying to build a movement, and that they really can be complementary. And that's, say, focusing on, right, by 2024, we want to have a party where we want representation in parliament, can also bring some kind of focus and could actually aid in building community, building the movement at a community level. I mean, if you've got small cells or you've got small branches emerging, people can start saying, well, what's in my community here? How can I engage in my community, get food gardens going, look at water problems, look at what the other problems are in the community as well. And then what form? I think, sure, that's a very big, long question. And I also think you've got people who have studied this kind of thing and would be able to come in and say, what would be the best way to have a party that would be truly participatory, flatter, not a hierarchical top-down. I'm sure there's lots of research that's been done on that and that people could contribute to that. And then eintlik wat's goed. Yeah, I quite like keeping things really basic and simple, and that the root word of capitalism is capital and the root word of socialism is social, and capital is a means of production. So one could explain things in quite an easy way. There are a lot of people who've said to me, yeah, but if you want to set up a party, you mustn't call it socialism because you're going to put people off. And I think we're living in a different world now, even to 4 or 5 years ago. The fact that Bernie Sanders could come and say he's a democratic socialist. 4 or 5 years ago, everyone would have said you're insane. That kind of politics could possibly happen in the United States of America. So that's that. And I also really like Chris Hani's quote on socialism. I'm sure everyone's very familiar with it. But it's so simple and so straightforward and very easy to translate into other languages as well, that. And then, yeah, neocolonialism is the last stage of the highest form of organized crime. I think we need to call it what it is, I've always liked Kwame Nkrumah's definition of neocolonialism. And this ism, that ism, all we are saying is give people a chance. There's no doubt in my mind that if we are to survive as a species, the current global system of neocolonialism is going to have to be radically and fundamentally changed to a post-capitalist one within the next 10 years at most. I'm not quite sure how that will happen. I think basically we actually fucked it. What that system will be is anyone's guess, but it will have to tackle inequality and ecocide head-on, clean up the industrial mess, be regenerative and socialized. And that sounds like eco-socialism to me. And if we want our next ism to be truly democratic, we need to start participating now already. Otherwise, we may well end up with national socialism. And capitalism is the final solution to the human question, but not the final answer to the human predicament. And then I had a good fortune in 1979 of living in a very remote village in the mountains of Lesotho, running away from the army. And it was really amazing there. It was like a cracked, but not a broken window into a world that existed before colonialism. Just the way the structure of the societies, the food that people grew, the livestock that people kept, and the way people practiced what the Basotho called Tshiamo, which is working together collectively for the hard work, like the threshing of the sorghum and the wheat, where everyone participates, but each family at the end of the day is responsible to maintain their own fields. And that in all those remote villages I traveled through, I never ever saw a jail, a salesperson, a soldier, a policeman, a politician, or a lawyer, or even a church for that matter. And no crime, not even petty theft, and no fences either. And I've been down to Ponderland a couple of times in the last few years. And I got a very similar sense there amongst the Amamponda people. People are poor, people struggle, there's nothing romantic about the life. But there's a certain kind of dignity that people have, People keep their heads held high, which was quite different to some of the other areas of the Transkei that I lived and worked in the 80s there, where people had been subjected to these betterment schemes. People theirs not held quite as high. I can't quite articulate it, but there's something different there. Yeah, may the global village emulate the African village. In the long run, it'll have to if we want to survive. And I've often imagined that those beautiful fertile lands in the Free State, so-called Free State, that the Basotho call the stolen lands, if that could go back, change from being these vast agribusiness, monoculture, just millies forever, back to kind of more traditional ways of farming. Just imagine how many more people could be living a good quality life, what kind of produce they could be producing. It could be a very different world. Okay, nearly there. And just as an addendum, here's some snippets from Joe Slover's As Socialism Failed that I found to be quite uplifting and relevant to this conversation of ours. I'll just read through them quickly. The concept of a single party state is nowhere to be found in classical Marxist theory, and the mission to promote real democracy under one party system is not just difficult, but in the long run impossible. The way forward is through thoroughgoing democratic socialism, a way which can only be charted by a party which wins its support through democratic persuasion and ideological contest, and not, as has too often happened up to now, by a claim of right. And a multi-party post-apartheid democracy, both in the national democratic and socialist phase, is desirable. And state power must clearly rest in the elected representatives of the people, and not directly or indirectly in the administrative command of any party. And then lastly, the future is abundant. One of the most heartwarming and uplifting WhatsApp messages I received a couple of months ago when I was really feeling very down was from a young 17-year-old Fridays for Future activist. I think we all know who she is. I'm sure she won't mind me sharing her WhatsApp message. Yeah. She said, I've been thinking about you this lockdown. I read the autobiography of Malcolm X these past few days. I think it changed me. I've been very angry at the system and the government, and I want to do something. I want to help change things. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help with your political party. Except it's not my party and it's not my call. And I'm going to continue mobilizing support for the idea until that call is made. And my own feeling about it is that if someone is abusing someone else, you don't require a mandate from anybody to try and intervene in whichever way you can. So I'm not here on anybody's mandate. But over the past 2 years, on our social media group, which is called Sharp, these are some of the quite interesting reasons people have given for why they would be interested in becoming part of joining or helping to form a new political party. We don't have to go through them all. I just thought I'd include them so that people can read them through at their own time. It makes some interesting reading, which I've for them. There we go. That's it. Thank you.